Hey folks, David Stewart here. Fantasy author David V. Stewart. In fact, here are some fantasy books which I pinned myself. I'm here to talk about wheelchair accessible dungeons. Yes, you heard me right. Wheelchair accessible dungeons. This is indeed a thing. Wizards of the Coast, the company which owns the trademark for Dungeons and Dragons, a property which they did not create, but now have the rights to publish games called Dungeons & Dragons, as they have announced their first wheelchair-accessible dungeon. Now, if this seems rather silly to you, you're not alone, and it's pretty easy to dunk on this or to talk about their general pattern of strange attitudes towards a fantasy game, but I think it's actually more interesting to look at how this reveals the millennial attitude towards characters in the RPG space. Not just tabletop RPGs, but like video games, and really not just that, but fiction and fantasy in general. And that it's very different from the previous generations, the generations that played Dungeons and Dragons of yore. So wheelchair accessible dungeons. Now, like someone asked, why can't my hero be in a wheelchair? I mean, after all, Stephen King had a hero that was in a wheelchair. My hero can be in a wheelchair too. And the real question is, why would you imagine that? Or why would you think you would need a wheelchair accessible dungeon? All dungeons are wheelchair accessible because they don't exist. So if you're like, well, my character's in a wheelchair, and the DM's like, yeah, okay, well, here we go into the dungeon. It has ramps. Like, and why would you build ramps? It's like, oh, we could stop those heroes in wheelchairs if we just put some stairs in, right? All of those things are a little bit silly, but what it really points to is that people who are disabled want a character who is like them. That is to say, the people who play Dungeons & Dragons now view their characters as themselves, as inserts of themselves rather than something external to the self. If you go back and you play original D&D, character death is real. Your character might get chomped in half by some monster on the way to the dungeon and never even make it there, and you're going to have to roll a new character. That is a reality. That's part of it. That's part of the fun of the game, is that, mistakes happen, or you get a couple bad luck rolls, and there you go. Your level 1 wizard just died, and you're going to have to roll a new character. So Glorfak the half-orc was never you. Rather, he was a character you imagined that was going to play his role within this dungeon setting called Dungeons and Dragons. Now, Glorfak the orc is somehow you. That's the millennial attitude towards it. And you see this actually impact all of the game design in the, 5th edition D&D, really most of the newer editions. And that is that there is a there's a severe fear of character death. Character death is basically not allowed and should be avoided. And you see lots of people talk about, if your characters die, if you're DM, you need to find some way for them to bring their characters back, because it's so tragic for their characters to die. And those of us who played like old school D&D are like, why? Just roll another character, just think up another character and play it. What's the big deal? Yeah, like in a real story, some characters die too, it happens. So the reason that they don't die is because they're viewed as inserts. They're self-inserts. I need a wheelchair accessible dungeon because I'm in a wheelchair. And I want my hero to be in a wheelchair because the hero is me, and I want to feel like a hero. You can see there's several layers of self and fantasy and escape of self, rather than escaping to imagining things outside of yourself. It's very interesting when you stop and think about it, but I think you see this really go through all the rules in 5th edition D&D, which is why the rules feel rather shallow, and it's not so much about gameplay. Rather, the game has transformed from a game that has, story associated with it, maybe. Really, it's about your story, not the story, to something that is more an attempt to have people gamifying narrative. That is, it's more about some sort of narrative and story experience rather than playing the game, rather than how the rules work and how you're going to use those rules to overcome difficult challenges. If player death is off the table, then there really isn't any meaningful challenge. Rather, you're creating a rule set to make events happen through some sort of narrative, through some sort of story, in order to create a story experience for the players rather than having the players just play a game. It's a very different attitude and approach, I think, to gameplay in general. Now, I don't think this exists in a vacuum. I mean, video game RPGs are this way as well. You notice all those customization options. It's like, those are fun, but people are often trying to imagine a better version of themselves. And at the same time, they choose, like, they choose romance options that they themselves would choose, and they play a character that they themselves would play. It's a self-insert. They are playing themselves as that character. They're not imagining a character outside of themselves. And so I remember I've had conversations with people because, like, I played, Dragon Age or something, but it's a female character. And it's like, you're not a girl, though. And it's like, I'm also not a Grey Warden. I just wanted to imagine this character as female. It's like, and she married Alistair or something, right? Like, what's the big deal? It's like, well, you're not attracted to Alistair. No, but my character might be. I thought Alistair was a good guy. Maybe she should hook up with him. I'm an author, so I don't view my characters as me at all. My characters are my characters, and they want things that maybe I'm not interested in, and that's how it is. I've never really had this attitude of like a character is me. Even if I sometimes name it after myself, it's not me. I've played female characters in World of Warcraft, and a lot of males do because they're aesthetically more pleasing. They like to look at girls versus looking at boys all the time. And I really like JRPGs basically because there is no self-insert in it, especially as JRPGs have developed. Really from like, say if we look at Final Fantasy, because I've been playing that a lot on the channel. Final Fantasy IV, pretty much on, you have a set cast of characters and they are the characters, and you are just a kind of a puppet master pulling them through gameplay elements and then watching a story happen as part of that. So you're playing the game and watching a story happen. So it's kind of a mishmash of a cinematic experience and a game experience. And that's fine. That's an enjoyable experience, but those characters are external. What you get with D&D is this character is really me, and to have me die, to have this character I care about die, there's an emotional attachment to the character because you view it as yourself and because you've played it for a long time and things like that. That's really not part of wargaming. Dungeons & Dragons started off with wargaming roots and has evolved past that into odd places. So if you want to understand like OSR, if you want to understand like old school rule sets, original rule sets, D&D 1.0 or AD&D, and the type of people that play them, they're really interested in the gameplay and how the rules set up the limits of play and how you're going to play around with those limits of play, not so much some sort of story experience. And I'm not going to, if you're watching this and you're into the story experience, that's what I'm trying to communicate to you, is that there's a different attitude from how it was originally. And so I find it a little bit interesting that that's the way millennials have gone, is that we have to have wheelchair accessible dungeons because we have to have an adventure in wheelchairs because I'm in a wheelchair. Otherwise, if you think about like a medieval fantasy setting, there would be no adventurers who were severely crippled. Even in, even like a Stephen King character in the wheelchair, Susanna, she has to be carried around by the other characters. She's very dependent on the other characters because her physical limitations are profound. So if you have a severe disability, you're probably not going to be going adventuring in dungeons. You're going to find something else to do, and you're going to trade with the adventurers who go to the dungeons. And that's really the way it is. And to me, because I'm in a little bit older generation, it's like I don't write down characteristics of the characters, like deaf in right ear. I'm going to make this character just like me, and so he will be weak to all attacks on the right hand side. It's like, well, we need to make a dungeon that's accessible for people who are hard of hearing. It's like, I wouldn't really think that. It's like, no, I'm going to imagine like a barbarian, and barbarians, of course, are big and strong. What I think might be an interesting rule set, if you were going to go that way, if you're going to have disabilities, is like every character has to pick a disability that gives them like some sort of severe weakness, like they're deaf, so they can't hear enemies approaching or something, or they're blind, so they have to follow the party or something like that. And they're purely a support character or something like that. So if you're going to give characters severe disabilities, you could create some really interesting gameplay that way, but it has to be part of the game. In this case, it's like we're going to take a thing that doesn't exist, the dungeon, and we're going to make it wheelchair accessible. All dungeons are wheelchair accessible. You just say they are. So if you want to play a character that's in a wheelchair and your DM's like, let's all have a disability, or your character can have disability just like you, we'll just pretend all the dungeons have wheelchair ramps, so you can just imagine that if you want to. That's what you want to role play as. You just make it work. You don't even really have to adopt special rule sets for that. You just ignore the stairs, and you're pretty much good to go as far as that goes. So anyway, that's an interesting thought to me, and I see that with a lot of millennial literature that's very popular with millennials, particularly fantasy. So a book like, say, Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss has a character that to me is very cringy and is very much a Mary Sue. But he's very popular with people, and I think it's because people like to engage in power fantasy. So when they're reading the story, they're not just experiencing a story, they're engaging. There's an extra layer of things going on. They're engaging in a fantasy of being that character and imagining that power fantasy. Another one was, I think it was Prince of Thorns, which I really didn't like. For this reason, is that the character was very much a Mary Sue. It was written like a 13-year-old's power fantasy. Well, some people really like that because that's what they do with fiction, I guess. And that's really not the way I read books or the way I experience them. But for some reason, I think that a lot of people in the millennial demographic, and especially the younger millennial demographic, are very, 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 very into actively imagining themselves as the character in some sort of role play scenario. And I see that with a lot of the fiction, more popular fiction that's come out, is that there's a central character who's like uber powerful, and people like to imagine that they're that character. And a lot of the situations the character gets put in, like, the character is just magically good in bed, things like that happen because that's an attractive fantasy for people to engage in with themselves, to imagine themselves in that situation. And so I think it just kind of folds over into RPGs. And as I see that, if somebody's playing the latest BioWare RPG, they roll a character that's like themselves. They want the same-sex relationship options open because they themselves are gay and they want to play as a gay character. Whereas I would never think, I would think, maybe my character's gay. Maybe I'm going to play as a gay character. I think I've actually done that before. It's like, why not? I haven't played it this way before. Let's see what the same-sex romance is. And we'll just see what that's like. We'll see what the dialogue is for that. And for me, it's not like, oh no, am I gay because because I rolled a female character and dated another female? Am I actually a trans lesbian? No, I don't think that, because that character's not me. That's just a different character, and I'm just experiencing a different way that the story could exist. So anyway, that's a different approach to viewing the game and viewing storytelling in general that I think is very different for millennials than it was for past generations. Where past generations viewed characters as something very apart from themselves, and the pseudo-social relationship that millennials have with the character is more about like inserting themselves and imagining themselves as that character, whether it's in a tabletop RPG setting or in a video game RPG setting or even just in a book. Okay, so thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I've talked about some of these things before, but I thought I'd pull them together with the wheelchair accessible dungeons thing. And let me know what you think down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Tell me if it was necessary to create a wheelchair accessible dungeon. What would you do if you were playing a game and someone's like, "Well, I want to roll a character in a wheelchair"? How would you follow through with that? Okay, well, I have to create the rule set for people in wheelchairs. You can move one square, I don't know. I don't know how I would deal with that. So anyway, take it easy, and I will see you guys next time.